Hi everyone, welcome back to Talks in Class. I'm Jenna. Thanks as always for joining me today. I'm so happy to have you here listening to the podcast. Not really much to report around here, I'm gonna be honest. It's just that long stretch of winter where there just doesn't feel like there's anything happening day to day. You know, we don't have much to look forward to until like the spring. So it's just kind of same old, same old. I know a lot of places around the US have gotten just absolutely slammed with snow and really, really, really awful cold weather, especially over the last couple of weeks specifically. So I'm happy to not be experiencing that, but it's been gloomy and kind of cold and we've had a lot of rain here in LA. So we are feeling our own version of the winter blot. I really haven't done much of anything this past week. Actually, it rained all weekend, so we barely left the house other than to just do like our normal errands and stuff. I don't even have anything to watch on TV at this point. Like, I'm really just don't have anything to report to you guys. We did watch that new true crime documentary on Netflix over the weekend. It's called American Nightmare. It's about the woman who was kidnapped and then she returned back, and people were calling it a real life Gone Girl case. It was good. I mean, I like a true crime thing, but I watched it all in basically one sitting, so now I'm back to nothing. And then I tried to watch a few episodes of Pretty Little Liars over the weekend also. Honestly, really just for the fashion. You guys know I've been on a 2010s like rabbit hole lately, and that show has some of the most amazing like teen drama 2010s fashion of any example that I can think of. So it's really fun to revisit for that. But the actual plot of that show, I loved it when it was on, but it is not that good. I mean, a lot of those teenage dramas really kind of went off the rails, but Pretty Little Liars was by far the worst, I think. I mean, it really went insane in those later seasons. You can't even explain it. So anyway, that's kind of the news from here. Not much to report, but I am really excited about today's episode, so we'll get to that in a minute. But first, as always, I will start with my what good happened, and this is such a fun one. Oh my god, I went to a workout class last week, and it was my first time at this particular studio I've been wanting to go try for a long time. And I'm sitting in the studio before the class started, and I noticed this girl sitting like kind of near me, and I was like, oh my god, I recognize her. And she and I have basically been Instagram friends for years. I mean, several years at this point, like even back before I started posting my nostalgia content. Like, I didn't have a following or anything. I think we just found each other because we were both in New York and kind of had similar interests. So anyway, we've never met in person, and we saw each other in this workout class. Like, we just happened to be in the same class on the same day. Just one of those great coincidences, you know? So we ended up grabbing lunch after the class and catching up, and it was just so nice. I love it when stuff like this happens in general, but especially living in a city like LA, or like when this kind of stuff would happen in New York. It's just comforting. It's nice to be reminded that you can literally just run into somebody that you know out in the world. At this point, that concept feels quaint and old-fashioned, so it was fun. And speaking of being out in the world and also quaint and old-fashioned and also the 2010s, this week's episode is about a fairly specific topic, and it's something that feels really universal to the experience of being a 20-something in the early 2010s, which I was, and something that just took young people by storm, seemingly out of nowhere, and became a central part of my social life, as well as I think a lot of others my age, and also something that I still truly love, and that is brunch. If you are a regular listener of the show, you may remember several episodes ago now in my fashion aesthetics of the 2010s episode, I talked about how I've been feeling so nostalgic for the 2010s, specifically the early 2010s recently. And it's kind of crazy when we think about the 2010s to think that like 2017 was 7 years ago now. To give some context, to like let you process this in your brain a little bit easier for my millennials out there, especially 2005, when I graduated from high school, to 2012, when I was supposedly at least a fully grown adult, that was a 7-year difference. So 2005 to 2012 is the same time difference as 2017 to now. That's kind of hard for me to digest, but For those of you who were there, those who remember, if you think about 2012 and 2005, I mean, they were completely different worlds. 2005 was pre-Great Recession, you know, it was kind of peak Mick Bling, it was emo, it was MySpace, it was Abercrombie, it was kind of the height of a lot of that. 2012 was post-recession technically, but we were still very much feeling the effects of that downturn. And in many ways, I think that this was kind of peak millennial culture around this time. It was the time of the girl boss and the hipsters. I mean, this was Nicki Minaj and Avicii and Mumford and Sons and Taylor Swift's Red album. It was the time of, you know, Tory Burch flats and fake glasses and quirky little tote bags with things like owls on them and, you know, craft beers, craft burgers, just artisanal everything. And when it came to socializing, it was the era of perhaps the most millennial pastime that I can even think of, which is brunch. And when I say brunch, when I talk about brunch specifically in the early to mid 2010s especially, I mean brunch with a capital B. Brunch, okay? Brunch as an event. Brunch as a reason to put on your best outfit to get absolutely smashed in the middle of the day on a Sunday, to post blurry, poorly lit, way overly filtered photos of, you know, French toast and eggs Benedict on your newly created Instagram account with some quirky, ironic handle that definitely wasn't your name because that was not cool at that time. And of course, brunch existed before the 2010s. I know that. I'm aware. Prior to event brunch, though, brunch with a capital B, that I came to know in my 20s, brunch was simply just a meal. This was a combination of breakfast and lunch, hence brunch, which I feel like this was usually reserved for things like holidays or maybe a church event or just kind of boring, somewhat formal events that I would have had no interest in attending when I was young. I feel like in general, growing up, my opinion of brunch wasn't necessarily positive. I feel like the idea of brunch felt sophisticated, but not in a good way. You know, it felt kind of stuffy, kind of old, like something your pushy great aunt who really thought girls should take etiquette classes would enjoy doing. Certainly not something that I would associate with young, hip, cool, fun people, and definitely not something that I would associate with getting sloppy drunk off of cheap champagne before 2 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon. But it was like I blinked and suddenly there I was, 25 years old, wearing Kardashian brand faux leather leggings and over-the-knee Vince Camuto riding boots with a red lip and a top knot and no fewer than 6 or 7 costume jewelry bangles on each wrist, just aggressive bracelet stacks, clinking, clanking, as I trekked across Manhattan every single Sunday without fail in pursuit of another, you know, bottomless mimosa carafe and some mediocre egg entree that I was definitely gonna take a picture of. When I say that I lived for brunch in the early to mid 2010s, I don't think that that quite communicates my level of commitment to this event. It was my entire social life. I worked all week. I was tired. You know, I was early in my career. I had a job that I probably hated. I wasn't in college anymore. And because I was tired, because I was no longer in college, but also because, you know, I was perpetually broke from being a combination of overeducated and underemployed from graduating with not 1 but 2 degrees into an economy that was just absolutely in the toilet, but also living in New York City because I was young and dumb and wanted to have fun. I wasn't interested in going to clubs anymore. I had kind of aged out of the clubs, but really I couldn't afford the clubs because, let's be honest, even in 2012, a single, you know, crappy rail vodka was $20 at any sort of fancy club in New York City. I remember one time going to a club in the Meatpacking District. I think this was 2012. I ordered 2 drinks, 2 vodka cranberries, and I almost hit the floor. I almost passed out when the bartender handed me my little slip with my card to sign, and it was $40 for 2 like rail drinks. I looked this up because I was curious. With inflation, that would be about $53 today for 2 drinks. And this is when I was broke, 20 something. That was probably my grocery budget for the entire week. So needless to say, the clubs were not my scene. So when I think back to this time and how brunch really got the rebrand of the century, I think, how it somehow went from this kind of stuffy, kind of fancy weekend meal where you would definitely need to be on your best behavior to a sloppy, loud day party, really is what it was, where it was perfectly acceptable to black out in broad daylight. I think a big factor is the economy. Millennials reaching adulthood, but also starting to realize that we were unable to keep up with the milestones of previous generations largely due to at least our financial situations. And also a lot of millennials moving back into cities or staying in cities. I think this also can be attributed to our sort of arrested development. If you were 26 and struggling to build a career and making a small salary that could barely keep up with your rent plus your student loan payments, and you were completely single and just nowhere even near considering having children, living in a big city honestly just made you feel better about yourself and your current state in life. Because there are people doing all sorts of things in cities at any phase in life. There are people who are single, there are people who are child-free, there are people living with roommates, there are people working unconventional jobs, multiple jobs, gigs, whatever, across all ages in a big city. And I'm not saying that those people do not exist in smaller communities or suburbs, but I think it's just less common and it was easier to find examples of that in a big city. And I think a lot of people my age who were kind of faced with this reality really kind of smacked over the head with it. Looking back, we were not, or at least I was not, fully anticipating this. I truly just got smacked over the head with it when I graduated for the first time in, the early 2010s, opted to live in big cities as a way to kind of embrace this delayed adulthood and take back some sort of power, or at least I definitely felt this way. If I can't afford a house anyway, I may as well live in New York and have some fun while I'm sharing a crappy apartment with roommates. So when we think about brunch, capital B brunch, as an event and the absolute chokehold, truly, that it had on millennials when it exploded onto the scene, I think we really have to think about the economics of millennials' lives at this time. The best thing about brunch by far really was the fact that it was pretty cheap for what you got. You got, one, a meal, and even if it wasn't that great, it was usually halfway decent at least, and you didn't have to cook it. So that was a win in itself. And two, unlimited booze for a set duration of time. And even though we were broke, and we were seeking this out in large part because we were broke, there was an element of sophistication, classiness that came with the idea of brunch. It certainly felt classier than the club. And I think that was also appealing at that time in our lives. The bottomless brunch, though, became an Olympic sport, basically. I mean, I can't speak for everyone in the country, but in the early 2010s, I did live in Dallas, I lived in New York City, and I also lived in South Jersey near Philadelphia. So I did a healthy amount of brunching in all three of those places. New York, Philly, and Dallas. And I will say that brunch was certainly alive and well in all of them, but the brunch culture in New York City was something else. So when I say that this was a sport, I mean, I literally had a list, a spreadsheet of every single bottomless brunch special that I would hear about. I would have the restaurant name, the neighborhood it was in, the type of food, the price, and what you got for the price, any sort of details that I needed to know about, how to make a reservation, whether they took reservations, what time the tables opened. I mean, it was a whole thing. In the early days of brunch, or at least in my early days of brunching, so around 2012 or, that general timeline, the unlimited brunch specials in Manhattan and also the ultra gentrified areas of Brooklyn were honestly phenomenal. They were so good. It was like an entree plus unlimited mimosas for $30. And it was none of this 2-hour time business that everybody has now. It was straight up unlimited in those days. And not everywhere, but there were places that you could seek out, and hence the spreadsheet. Like, they would just continue to feed you booze until they literally had to kick you out because they were closing or getting ready to shift over to their dinner service. And most places opened at 11, and the lunch to dinner switchover would happen at 4 p.m., which meant that if you went to one of these truly unlimited bottomless brunches, you could drink for 5 straight hours, unlimited, plus eat for like $30. So economically speaking, you can't beat that. I mean, we were making a sound economic decision by attending these brunches. And socially, it checked 2 boxes for us, or at least for me. One was the idea of going out to a meal with friends, which felt kind of mature. You know, it felt like a step away from that time spent in these crappy bars in college. It was a more dignified form of socializing or going out. But the other, obviously, was straight up partying. Because make no mistake, we were getting wasted at brunch, except for it felt classy to get wasted because it was brunch. And I think this was just a really perfect combination to kind of satisfy those dual cravings that we were having during this kind of weird transitional time of early adulthood of, you know, feeling more grown up, but not too grown up. We could still have fun. It was just like in a more mature setting. It felt more mature to us. It was the perfect recipe for an ideal social situation for millennials during that specific life stage, you know, early to mid 20s, we'll say. And in New York, I don't know about other places, but there were so many brunch specials. It was a whole job to keep track of them. It felt like every restaurant started to jump on this, and they would kind of try to one up the specials, or they would copy, you know, specials from other places. There were all sorts of different kinds of environments for this too. There were like super trendy spots, and then there were the places that were like straight up clubs, like day clubs. And then there were other more low-key, just good old standby brunch spots that had really cheap bottomless deals. Those were always my favorite. There was this place in Hell's Kitchen, and I think they had a downtown location too, probably like Chelsea or somewhere like that. I can't remember the name, but it was sort of American Italian type of food. Anyway, that was one of our go-tos in those days because they had a great special, and they would never let your mimosa get before about half full before they'd come fill it up. I mean, they were on it, which meant you were getting trashed if you went to brunch there. The number of times that I stumbled out onto 9th Avenue just fully expecting it to be the middle of the night, because at that point we had been drinking for hours, and then being shocked to see that it was actually broad daylight because it was 3 or 4 p.m. every single time. I mean, I can't even count how many times. But as you can imagine, the fact that these bottomless specials were unlimited and they were such great deals meant that getting a table, especially for the ones without time limits, was really, really difficult for a while, especially when this was really hot and it was kind of new on the scene. The especially hot, trendy places would have miles long wait lists. Some places even stopped taking reservations because people would no-show. So it was just first come, first serve. And people would be lining up for these brunch spots like it was Black Friday 1999 and they were about to get a big screen TV for 80% off. I mean, it was intense. Portlandia even did a full episode on this. It's called Brunch Village from 2012, where the entire episode just kind of chronicles the characters waiting in this line at, you know, whatever the newest trendy brunch spot is in town, because they're trying to get this specific viral pancake, I think it is, that everybody's talking about. It's one of my favorite episodes, but it really was like that, especially at sort of these trendy hotspot places that got a lot of buzz around them. Especially if the place had some sort of specialty item that people wanted to post on their Instagram, or just like generally a really cute aesthetic, again, that people wanted to post on their Instagram. So my friends and I were making our brunch reservations sometimes weeks in advance to try to get a table at some of these places. And then we'd constantly discover new spots to add to our brunches so that we would try those. And of course, the biggest way that I personally would discover these new brunch hotspots was Instagram. And once the bottomless specials became just really common, it was just kind of assumed that at that point, everywhere that served brunch had some sort of deal. Like if you saw brunch, you assumed they had some sort of bottomless deal that went with it. At that point, it really became all about the aesthetic of the restaurant. And it's funny looking back, like the food quality kind of feels like it was last on the priorities, at least within this brunch culture at the time. It was drinks, and then it was the Instagram photo, and then food quality was least important on the list. But especially as we progressed a little further into the 2010s, especially around the mid 2010s, like 2014, 2015, 2016, the aesthetics of brunch really, I think, became a driving force behind its continued popularity. If you think about the trajectory of Instagram and also this kind of do it for the gram culture that came with the rise of Instagram, this makes total sense. In the early 2010s, when Instagram was new, our feeds were chaotic messes, okay? We'd throw a different filter on every low quality kind of blurry picture. We'd post it, we'd get 2 likes, and then we'd post another photo 3 hours later, just not a care in the world. It was a magical time. But by the mid 2010s, that really shifted in this major way where having an attractive feed somehow became important. Like your whole feed had to go together and it had to look pretty. Some people had whole themes for their feed, and like every photo had to fit the theme, and it was like so much pressure. So people were seeking out specific places to go or specific things to do purely for the Instagram photo. And it really became this like do it for the gram. And if you think about kind of that millennial brunch culture, especially around the mid 2010s, like I'm thinking like 2016 specifically, there was nothing more aesthetic than brunch. In the early 2010s, again, it was a little bit messier still. The brunch aesthetic was still really heavily hipster influenced. It just feels like Brooklyn to me when I think back on it. All of those super trendy brunch spots kind of had this same aesthetic. It was that rustic industrial decor with like white subway tile and exposed brick and exposed ductwork on the ceiling, and just a lot of raw wood and a lot of metal, like those uncomfortable farmhouse metal chairs, or even worse, those round metal stools that you literally have to sit on to eat your meal. They might have even had communal seating. That was a thing for a while. Whoever thought of this should be put straight in jail. This was such a thing in New York City, and it was awful, okay? I don't really have a lot of critiques when it comes to restaurants. Like I can get down with a lot of different things. This was awful. It was literally a long table with benches, that's the worst case scenario, or slightly better chairs just lined up on either side. So you would sit across from the person you were actually with, but on either side of you were complete strangers, like a foot away from you. They were at the same table because it was one long table. Actually, I'm pretty sure Portlandia also made fun of this concept in an episode. And in that episode, there's a couple breaking up at one of these communal tables, and the person next to them is listening to their conversation and then asks if they want to share an appetizer. But that's what it was really like. It was like being at the cafeteria table in high school, except you were paying, $13 for a cocktail and $22 for an artisanal burger while basically having a meal with a stranger next to you. Terrible. But anyway, all these restaurants had a similar vibe. They served food on wooden boards. They all had those white farmhouse cloth napkins with the blue stripe down the middle, or maybe it was a red stripe. And every drink that wasn't a mimosa, this is really important, every drink that was not a mimosa was served in a mason jar. The mason jar trend cannot be, I can't stress this enough. Like if I could choose just one thing, one item that defined millennial brunch culture, it's the mason jar, hands down. No contest. Maybe this restaurant would have a chalkboard wall, but they almost certainly had a chalkboard A-frame sign outside on the sidewalk with some quirky phrase that was just begging to be posted on Instagram, like work hard, brunch hard, or it's not day drinking, it's brunch. And I ate this all up, you guys. I posted so many of those signs on Instagram, and I regret nothing. It was a moment in time. I had such a good time. But as the hipster thing faded into kind of the girl boss thing in the mid 2010s, that brunch aesthetic also shifted. The chalkboard walls became a grass wall or a flower wall, maybe with a neon sign slapped on it. Again, just begging for Instagram. The white subway tile and exposed ductwork stayed, but the iron and the wood and all the metal became rose gold and fake white marble. Another thing that cannot be overstated, you guys. Everything was rose gold and fake white marble. This, to me, this whole aesthetic, this whole moment was the peak of the super curated Instagram feed, the do it for the gram culture, where people were quite literally seeking out entire experiences just to post it on Instagram. I started seeing the shift probably 2015, 2016. It's really so much easier to see it now in hindsight, but at the time I didn't notice that this was happening, of course. But by 2017, 2018, this was the vibe. I mean, this was everywhere. And I don't think that this is any coincidence that this happened, because this aesthetic was ultra Instagrammable. That's a mouthful. Ultra Instagrammable. And especially as the brunch market became just more saturated, right? Like every restaurant on the planet was doing brunch by 2016. You didn't have to wait to get a reservation for a brunch anymore. You didn't have to stand in a line. It was just kind of everywhere. So restaurants had to stand out in some other way. So I think a lot of them did this really intentionally by creating interiors that were quite literally made for social media. I mean, how many times have we all seen that rose all day neon sign from Hampton Social on our Instagram feeds? I mean, hundreds of times. And similar things happen with actual food around this time too. There were these viral trends that emerged that were just fodder for Instagram, you know, like the cronut, which people would line up for outside of that bakery in Soho just so they could post it on their Instagram. Those rainbow bagels that I'm sure probably tasted just like any generic bodega bagel you could find anywhere in New York City. The insane burgers with everything from like onion rings to mac and cheese to a donut on them, which gross. Honestly, that's gross. Or just gimmicky things that restaurants would do, like a make your own mimosa bar or a Bloody Mary bar, or those Bloody Marys with a whole meal on top. Bacon on everything. I feel like bacon really had this moment where everything was wrapped in bacon, or there was just bacon added to everything that you can imagine. The black tap milkshakes, those were such a huge trend for a while. Do you guys remember those? They were those crazy milkshakes that I'm sure you've seen on Instagram. They were all over Instagram in like 2015 or so, with just like a foot of junk piled on top of the milkshake. They went viral on Instagram, so people would seek them out for Instagram, for the photo. I went to Black Tap once, just once, and the milkshake was fine. I mean, it's a milkshake, but nobody needs a whole slice of cake on top of their milkshake. You know, there was cotton candy on some of them. There were whole like giant cookies. I don't remember which one that we got, but we had to take all the toppings off to actually consume the milkshake. You know, all that stuff was just for the photo. And then a bunch of restaurants really emerged around this time with interiors that really feel similarly curated for the photo op. Cha Cha Matcha is my favorite example of this. I mean, they have it all. I have Instagrammed so many pictures inside Cha Cha Matcha. They have neon signs, they have a grass wall, they have really cute furniture that you can pose on, they have like a pink and green color theme. The restaurants would all have one wall that had their restaurant name or something really identifiable, so you could hold something up and take the photo in front of that, which is great marketing if you think about it. You know, me taking a picture of my matcha in front of the Cha Cha Matcha wall, it's just telling everybody, like, come here to take your own Instagram photo. Pietro Nolita is another great example. It is a restaurant in Nolita, New York City. This place took over, like completely took over my Instagram feed when it opened in, I think, 2016, because it is so Instagrammable. It is all pink, like millennial pink and hot pink, probably with some neon signs. And I can confidently, like 100% say that I would have no idea that this restaurant even existed if it weren't for these really bold decor choices that they made that just happened to be the color that was basically branded as millennials' favorite color of the time. And then the flood of Instagram pictures that came from this decor that they clearly made a choice to have. And before we knew it, this Instagram aesthetic, you know, this do it for the gram Instagram aesthetic really took over. And I think as the original hipster influenced, young, broke, millennial kind of organic brunch thing evolved, it just lost some of its magic. You know, the more ubiquitous it became, the less appealing it kind of became. And that is the case for so many things. You know, they reach peak popularity and then they kind of fall off because we've seen it so many times. It doesn't feel exciting anymore. And the charm just kind of wore off. Seeing whole groups of girls spending half of their time at brunch taking photos of their food and their drinks and posing in front of the neon sign and taking like 20 different photos in front of the neon sign to make sure that they all got the one that they liked, it just really took something away from the experience that I think was really central to the idea of brunch in the early 2010s. I can't quite put my finger on. I'm just gonna call it the sloppy factor because before the days of posting literally every single moment of life on social media and curating the feed or, you know, choosing brunch restaurants for the photo, brunch was freaking sloppy. Okay, let's call it like it is. It was sloppy. We were sloppy messes. I would have died. I would have melted into a puddle if anyone posted a picture of me after one of those brunches on Instagram, because we weren't there for a photo. We were there to get wasted in the middle of the day in a socially accepted context. And don't get me wrong, I continued brunching. I still love a good brunch. But in my millennial mind, the heyday of brunch, if you will, the golden age, was from about 2012 to 2014, maybe 2015, we'll say. And it was a magical time, you guys. It really was. So to celebrate that special time in our lives, I'm going to end this episode with a list. And since we all know that I love the fashion of the early 2010s, here are my top 5 brunch events, plus the dress code I would have chosen for each, in no particular order. Number 5 is the casual friends Sunday brunch. This was my usual go-to brunch vibe, and really the best type of brunch in my personal opinion. You'd usually get the drunkest at these types of brunches because these were the brunches you would say that you weren't gonna drink that much or you weren't gonna stay out that late, and we all know how that goes. The dress code for this was casual and easy, which again is my favorite. For me, this was usually like distressed denim shorts or maybe my ripped black skinny jeans, a slouchy V-neck t-shirt, which was my absolute go-to, a long necklace with like a feather or maybe an owl on it, something very 2010s, maybe an arrow, and then seasonal accessories. If it was summer, maybe a straw fedora, or if it was winter, maybe a beanie and an infinity scarf. Small kind of dingy restaurants, especially downtown, like in the Village, were my favorite spots for these. And we'd usually end up at the bar afterward and then stumbling home around dinner time. So you had to be comfy. Number 4, shifting gears entirely, the day party brunch, essentially a club brunch. This was not my scene. I actually don't think I ever attended a proper day party like club brunch, but I did see many people stumbling out of them. The dress code for this, as you can imagine, was club wear. We're talking leather leggings, stiletto peep toe cutout booties, a brightly colored, maybe patterned shirt with a waist belt, or maybe a cropped little blazer in a bright color, or like a little tight leather jacket. It was truly a club in the middle of the day. I've seen videos of people dancing on tables in the middle of a Sunday afternoon at these places, so people dressed accordingly. I was down the street chugging mimosas at some hole-in-the-wall place in an oversized sweater that cost me $19 from Forever 21, so this was just not my vibe. Number 3, the out-of-town visitor brunch. This was a super common one for me living in New York in my 20s because people would obviously want to visit New York. And being that we were in our 20s, this was a very delicate balancing act because you had to find a place that was exciting enough. It needed enough of a vibe. It had to have something, you know, photo ops, good views, photogenic food, whatever. It needed to have some excitement, but also couldn't be super expensive because that New York City sticker shock is absolutely valid and you didn't want to scare off your guest or like spend all their money on a brunch. My answer to this, and actually a place that I spent more time in than I really should admit, was Hotel Chantel on the Lower East Side. If you are unfamiliar, with the glory that was their brunch, they would do a rooftop jazz brunch on Sunday. So this checked all the boxes. It was on a rooftop, you had some views, there was literal live jazz music, the vibes were really cute, it was a very cute photogenic space. But the kicker was that their drinks, their brunch cocktails were 92 cents. So it wasn't a bottomless special, but 92 cents. I mean, you really, unless you're drinking like 30 drinks, which I would be in the hospital. Most people would be in the hospital. It was a great deal. And in a lot of cases, actually better than the bottomless. So this was my go-to brunch spot. Dress code for this was definitely photo ready, but still casual because you were generally playing tourist. You needed to be comfy. My ideal look for this would be a black maxi dress, black so it didn't get dirty, a long necklace as always, probably some low ankle booties with like fringe on them, or those T-strap Sam Edelman sandals that we all had with like the skinny little T-strap, a bunch of bracelets, maybe even a floppy hat. We had to be a little trendy for the photo op, and then a huge tote bag that would have everything that you and your friend would potentially need for a long day running around the city. Number 2, the Instagram brunch. Going to whatever the new aesthetic hotspot that was all over Instagram was somewhat of a rite of passage, especially for somebody like me who was just prime age and demographic in every way for this kind of thing. And it was a whole process. First, you'd have to secure a reservation, which could be, you know, a challenge. Then you'd have to round up all the girlies to go to brunch. And most importantly, you had to get ready so that you would look good in the pictures, because that's why you were going. If you're going to an Instagram brunch, you're going for the photo. So dress code for this, as you can imagine, was as trendy and really as bougie as you could possibly get. I loved to do colorful skinny jeans, some sort of useless, you know, like a leopard print scarf, Tory birch flats, definitely a time to bust out the Tory flats, or the Tory boots if you were really fancy. Maybe even your Louis Vuitton bag would come out for this, or your fake Louis, no judgment from me. But this was something that you were, you know, getting ready for. You were definitely whipping out your Urban Decay naked eyeshadow palette to do a full smoky eye in the middle of the day for this. And number 1, the birthday brunch. Even the mention of this sends chills down my spine. This was the sloppiest of the sloppy when it came to brunch. You were probably bringing balloons, those big number ones, you know, that everybody had for the photo, probably in rose gold. You might have even had to bring a cake. I mean, this was a production. And somebody was gonna get way too drunk at this brunch. Somebody was gonna cry. It would probably be the birthday girl, but not necessarily always the birthday girl. It was a whole ordeal. It was a mess every single time, and it was fun about half the time. So dress code for this was somewhere in between the Instagram brunch and the club brunch. You were dressing up for the birthday brunch. Like, everybody in the restaurant was gonna know that you were there for a birthday. For the record, I just have to say, I waited tables for years in high school and college, and I am so glad that my serving years came before the brunch craze, because bless those people pouring mimosa after mimosa into the champagne flutes of these girls who were borderline blackout at 3 p.m. and about to send some questionable text to their ex. It was a time. The whole era was a time, and we've all grown since then, I think. I hope. And I hope you all really enjoyed this episode. If you know me, you know I could talk about brunch endlessly. So this was a fun one for me. If you did enjoy this episode, I of course would appreciate it if you share it with somebody else who might enjoy it. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'll be back next week, so I will talk to you all then. Bye!